Hey guys, welcome to the How They Did It podcast. I'm here with Steve Hall and Josh Liam. So you guys, both these guys have been guests on my podcast. Steve has the Revive Stronger podcast, which is maybe one of the best podcasts for natural bodybuilding, for bodybuilding, period. He has guests like Mike Israetel and many, many more. And I've actually been stealing some of his guests to come onto our podcast because I love them so much. I bring them on. Josh, as you guys know, he works with Lifetime Transformations. He's a physical therapist. He has an expertise in pain and pain management. When I tore my meniscus, Josh helped me get back in without surgery after 2 surgeries on this knee. So I really value Josh's opinion, and I want to bring a podcast, something different to Steve that he's not used to talking about with everybody else. So we're going to try to make it a little challenging for him because that's just how we do it here. Guys, welcome on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Tony.
All right, guys. So first thing I want to talk about, I'm going to start with Steve, and then I want to hear what Josh thinks of Steve's approach. So Steve has clients online. If anyone ever wants to go train with him, obviously here you can go to his website. He's a fantastic coach. You have guys training for bodybuilding shows. I am sure injuries come up, especially overuse injuries, tendon injuries, especially when we're getting deeper into the cut. How do you deal with athletes getting injured? How do you train around the injury? How much time do you give them off? How do you assess it? What's your protocol as a coach?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I would break it down into segments in terms of initially already trying to prevent injuries from the get-go. So that's coming through volume management largely, as in a lot of bodybuilders get overuse injuries. That tends to be the elbows, the knees, the shoulders. They start getting cranky. So making sure that volume is within recoverable amounts, and especially during a contest prep, average volume is going to be lower. We don't want it too low because you don't want to sacrifice muscle tissue. Obviously, volume is imperative to kind of giving us the anabolic signal, but volume management is key therefore, and managing that through the week, and obviously also frequency to some part too. I kind of see that as a role of divvying up the volume. The higher volume you have to do, probably the higher frequency you're going to want to have to keep it high quality, but also looking at kind of recovery timelines. Are you recovering session to session for joints and connective tissue as well as also the muscles? And then intensity. So I don't have people just train failure on every exercise all the time. That's something we can also modulate as well. It could even be if someone has pre-existing injuries that it's really those like last rep or two or that failure rep that causes them the biggest problem, and actually just staying a bit away from that allows them to have no issues. So definitely using kind of reps in reserve to help manage fatigue there too. And then exercise selection is a big one as well, and execution. So already going into working with someone, lots of things to prevent injury in terms of making sure they're executing exercises correctly, got the target muscle under kind of where we want it to be, picking exercises that feel good to them, to use a term from Mike Israetel, that kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio, making sure we're getting good amount of stimulus for not unnecessary fatigue. So probably not things that are like, I don't know, if their wrists get beat up easily from a barbell curl, we don't have to do a barbell curl. That's the great thing with bodybuilding, is we have so many tools in our toolbox as exercises that we can use. So that's where I'd start with them. Inevitably, injuries crop up. I kind of talk, I don't know if Josh agrees with this, but I think about injuries when you're training for any sort of sport to like a high level, so like bodybuilders taken to the stage, it's sort of like flies to a bin. You can kind of put rubbish in the bin, you can make sure to keep the lid closed, and you can kind of take the bin bag outside regularly, but flies going to come to the bin at some point. Similar to injuries, when you are pushing your body to its limit, you can do everything on the front end, like I talked about in terms of injury management, volume management, exercise selection, execution. But when you're pushing the body to its limits, injuries crop up. But it's about, and especially in a contest prep scenario, and I'm really big on my guys for this, if anything starts cropping up, like something just feels a bit off, is tell me kind of immediately. And I always just have the philosophy of, you can meet discomfort, but don't push through it. When you push through it, that is like, again, bodybuilders are bad for this. They're like, go hard, go home. They want to stick to the plan to a fault, and they're kind of pushed through these things. And I'd much rather, as I said before, there's so many ways we can train a bicep or a tricep or a delt. We don't have to stick to the exercise that's causing the issue. So I tend to approach it like that. As soon as something kind of comes up, make sure on the front end we're managing volume well, we're picking with the right exercise, execution is good, And then I look at how can we modify that exercise maybe first before we have to rotate it out. So like again, we have a wide range of rep ranges we can use, a wide range of tempos we can use. We can even remove parts of the range of motion if there's particular ranges of motion that are uncomfortable or painful, but we never want to push through that pain. And again, we can always rotate it out. So it might be even just adding a pause, for example, on like a squat pattern quite often removes knee pain because it's like they're maybe rebounding a bit too much out of the hole. So we do that. Or you could band it, for example. Hey, let's take off some load in that bottom position where we're loading the joints and connective tissue a lot. Maybe we do that. So I'm giving out probably too much in this initial answer because we need room to go. But another tool I do like is using BFR as well. So blood flow restriction training is super powerful in that we can use such light loads, under 30% of your one rep max potentially, which is just super easy, super light. But if we occlude a muscle group like on your arm or on your legs, we can generate a hypertrophic response through the body. And it's not always practical for every exercise, but that's also a tool that I like to use at my disposal. But they're just some of the ways that I kind of think about injury management for bodybuilders, especially during a contest.
Josh, do you have anything you would like to add to what Steve said, or things that you think you could do more with, or that ways that you approach it are different, or even if you just agree with them?
Yeah, I think very similar approach to that. Like lots of good info in there. Like load management is going to be really important. Mapping that out when that competition is, giving yourself adequate time to make sure that you're meeting the goal. Where a lot of people come undone is, they try and squeeze too much in too soon, as opposed to working with trainers like yourselves and actually mapping out that journey so that you're not trying to do too much too soon. And really like the example there where you're not just talking about muscle recovery, you're talking about other tissues recovering as well, joints, connective tissue. I think a lot of people come undone there as well, where they might feel muscularly okay, not too fatigued, but they're not allowing adequate recovery for tendons, joints, where that's going to start to get a little bit grumpier or have a bit more of a latent effect to sensitivity, where you come undone. And yeah, injury prevention certainly is going to be key. Once things get too irritated and you do actually have an issue in the tissue where you do need to change the loading or offload it, it becomes a little bit more difficult because there's not as much wiggle room. So if you get it right the first time, you've got good trust with your athletes that they're letting you know about little niggles, and then you can have a conversation together. Is this something that's been going on for a while, and is it a tissue such as a tendon that you can continue to train around as long as it's within kind of acceptable limits, or is this a new injury and something that if you train through is going to come undone, and then it is going to start to require actually time off loading? So I think really important to build that trust with the athlete, so you're on the same page and you can work it out together with it. And then the other strategies, again, perfect in terms of modifying range of motion. I think a lot of people get really fixated on a particular exercise because they get a good pump from it, or they've been doing it forever, or they've seen someone else in the gym doing it. So they're like, I want to do this exercise. And you just need to take a step back and say, what's the goal here? Do you want to do that exercise and you're trying to get stronger with that exercise, or is the goal here bodybuilding or a particular sport? Because if that's the goal, like Steve said, there's lots of different exercise variations that you can get there and you can achieve it, that you might be reducing range of motion to take compression off a tendon, or just letting the joint recover a little bit more. So yeah, I think lots of good stuff in there. Anything to add? I think I'm not sure if Steve monitors it as well. He mentioned around recovery, which is so important as well. And it's what metrics or how are we measuring recovery? Do you ask about, or do you track sleep, or is that by devices? And you guys are both massive on nutrition, so you're going to be making sure they're getting adequate nutrition. I think that's another piece of the puzzle I've seen from patients, is they train like athletes, but they don't recover like athletes. So, that either they're going out at night or they're doing other things where they're just not getting the adequate recovery. And that's potentially where they're going to come undone.
Yeah, I want to bring up something that Josh gave me as a tool when I was recovering of my knee, and I want to hear Steve's thoughts on it, and then maybe Josh can elaborate a little bit. I'm going to give the layman's version of it. So basically, when a lot of times when I was training, Josh told me when you're going to do the exercise, here was a kind of a rough rule, never train past a 4 out of 10 pain. Now that's quite subjective, obviously, like 4 out of 10 for me might be like, more than 4 out of 10 for somebody else. But having that in the back of my head kind of gave me this safety feature for when I was training, when my knee would feel a bit like I wouldn't immediately stop. And a lot of times I'd be able to get through the whole workout with, yeah, sure, it felt a little icky, but I was back. I could train like 2 days later, no problem, once I recovered. But having that, when I feel it a little too much, I'm like, is that a 4 out of 5? I would just be like, okay, I'm going to take the rest of this session off. Or I'm going to move on to another body part. And I really like that framework. And I've started using it with my clients now whenever they have like any little pains. And I think it helps people work around, we all, through every motion, you'll feel something in the tendon. Your elbow might click on, one press, and then the next one might be just fine. But if every time you kind of feel anything, you stop, you could stop training. I have like a lot of clients, especially general population clients, that they will almost never train because they're just in a constant cycle of being injured when it might not be a complete injury. One, I want to hear what you have to say about it, Stephen. If you've experienced anything like that with your clients, what you think of that framework.
For sure. I did just want to say, Josh, you're Tony. Josh mentioned like the sleep component, the nutritional component. They are absolutely key recovery elements as well that I would hope and my guys would have those in check. But totally, like if they're having bad sleep, like that almost is the foundation to everything sleep. So there's definitely things I monitor with my clients. And actually what you mentioned here in terms of the 4 out of 10 pain, it's not exactly what I use. We actually have lucky enough to have a physio on the Revive Stronger team. So one of the coaches is also a qualified physio. He does them both kind of part-time in that sense. So he's a competitive bodybuilder, physio. So like if anything is past my scope of practice, basically, of the things I mentioned, I could just kind of outsource to him. He can start prescribing rehab or prehab and various bits and pieces like that. So that's really valuable. But in regards to what you said, the 4 out of 10 pain, that's kind of similar to my don't push through pain. Like you can meet it, but don't push through it. It's kind of a similar sort of element to that. And I completely agree that often keeping moving helps recovery better than just abstaining completely. And you can almost create like I don't know, if you're ever, what's it called? If you get food poisoning based off oranges or orange juice at a time, you like then whenever orange juice or oranges come up, you're like, oh no, I can't. Like it's terrible because you've got this psychological thing with it. It's similar like certain exercises or certain muscles or a joints connective tissue. If they fell off, you just have this like psychological barrier. So it's better to kind of get in the mix of things. And the thing I always just make sure to do, and it sounds like this was part of your recovery, Tony, is if you are doing that, you've got that discomfort, each session, each kind of day, week, it's getting better. We're certainly not getting worse. As soon as it's starting to get worse, I'm like, we really have to change something. And I just need them to be honest. But yeah, that's kind of where I go with things.
Yeah. Again, agree in terms of making sure the trend's heading in the right direction, so you're not missing anything. I think the other couple of things to note is like the traffic light system in terms of training up to a particular number that's safe or caution, and then stopping is one way of monitoring it, but also just being aware of what tissue you're dealing with, because that 4 out of 10 isn't a hard rule depending on the different types of tissues. What to do, again, like for tendons, it works quite well as long as it's not like a really acute overload and it's really irritable, in which case you might be a little bit more conservative, or if it's a tendon sheath issue, or if it's a bone issue where all of a sudden we're going to be a bit more conservative of that 4 out of 10, and you might want to have minimal or no pain with a stress fracture or something like that. So very, very injury dependent in that regard. And also making sure in terms of you're picking your clients that you're doing that with as well. Some people are very, very vigilant and almost hyper vigilant with numbers. And I know a couple of times I've kind of come undone where I've put in this framework and I thought it was going to be appropriate for a particular patient. And then they come back and they almost map out that day at, 1050 out of 3 out of 10 pain. And then it took 20 minutes to settle down. So I think you just need to pick your clients in terms of making sure you're not actually increase hypervigilance. And that's where you might strip it back. And if they do have those fear avoidance behaviors and they're already very conscious about it, maybe those clients you're not checking in much, you're just objectively seeing how they're moving, how they're lifting. It looks pretty good. You're not going to check in. You might check in at the end of the day or or the next day with a really broad question of how did you get on, or something that's not too leading about getting them thinking about pain more and more. So I think, yeah, it's a useful tool, but it's like anything, you kind of got to pick your clients for when you're to apply it.
Yeah, I think this is like a really interesting thing because all three of us coach. Josh practices. Josh works also with some of my clients in lifetime transformations. He has some of his own clients do it as well. And the one thing that I've learned from Josh is that you have to take everybody individual, especially when it comes to things about pain tolerance and pain management, because I think people experience it very differently. Like we have a client that at some point that Josh was working with too, and he is hyper aware of his sensations and pain, and he's almost magnifies everything that is a pain. Is like he's like, up this, I don't know what this is, my tendons might blow up, could be the end of the world. And when I used to try to help him before I gave him completely to Josh, I would just be like, you got to push through a little bit. And then every time he'd be like, oh, I feel 4 out of 10. He couldn't, what his 4 out of 10 was, it took me a long time to realize this was just much lower than what my 4 out of 10 was. And I was like, it was really hard for me to understand how to program that in a way that could help him. And Josh has had much more success with it, I think, because understanding those psychological differences with each person, individual differences when it comes to pain tolerance.
Sorry, Josh, go for it.
I was going to say, there again, you're applying similar principles with exercise selection. Like if you've got someone that's quite hypervigilant, and the client was speaking about seeing several other people previously, and he's start to lose a bit of faith in the process. If you can try and get them loading moderately heavy in a reduced range, and they're starting to get a bit more trust in that body with it, you're starting to have little wins as opposed to picking an exercise that might be your textbook exercise that you've seen for tendon rehab. It is just those subtle things. You're not changing where, a big part of it, but it's just those subtle changes that start to push them in the right direction and get more confidence in that body and thing.
I was just going to say, I really liked the individualization to kind of pain management, and like it could be the same injury on two different people, but you have to manage that client differently just based off how they deal with it in general and how they feel it and sense it too. And it just reflects everything within coaching. Some people are starving hungry at higher body fat percentages in a smaller calorie deficit as someone in prep. Like there's a genetic component towards that and how they feel and deal with that, and you just have to take every person as they come. Like you mentioned, tracking sleep and monitoring that, which is something that I do with clients. And some people will get like really into it. They get their aura ring, and then they'll get hyper focused on all the stages and taking various supplements. And they're almost like, whenever they have slightly poor sleep, or if they're like, oh man, I wanted to get up out of bed to go to the loo, but I knew then that would harm my score. So I was just holding it for as long as possible. And then I was really stressing out. And then I went to the loo or whatever. And it's like, we just need to remove that tool because it's no longer helping us. So it's like picking and choosing various tools and things, or like the scale. Everyone can relate to that. I say even for me, because bodybuilders are pretty good about using the weighing scale, but I've had clients where we remove it because it's just like it's causing too much stress and anxiety. You looking at that each day, even though we're educating and taking a weekly average, we know it's not the be all end all and it's just a number, but some people just need that removed. And then you use other tools, and like you take a bit more of a hands-off approach to those people. I really love that description from Josh in regards to kind of, dealing with different individuals and how they deal with the pain and monitor it themselves.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring something else up here. Steve, have you ever had any injuries throughout your bodybuilding career generally? And if you had, I don't know if your experience is similar to mine. I've had a tremendous amount of injuries because I've picked, the life of being a professional fighter for a long time, and normally that's how that ends up. So I've broken a bunch of bones. I've had a bunch of surgeries. I've done physical therapy way more than I've ever wanted to do in my life. And
Should
one
have
thing
tried
that
to
I've
get hit
noticed,
less, Tony.
that's my coaches told me too. It didn't work out that way. But one thing I realized then is that it's changed so much how physical therapy is done. When I was getting injured, a lot of the physical therapy was like, at least were the places I went for the most part, were ultrasound therapies, laser therapies, manual stretching, manual massaging, stuff of that nature. Sometimes even like semi walking into the lane of chiropractics and cracking and stuff of that nature. And to be honest, I very rarely got much better from my injuries. I just learned to live with my injuries at some point. That's just how like I walk with a limp. I walk with a limp, wonky limp now because of it. Did you experience anything like that, having injuries early on in your career? And have you been injured recently? Have you seen the change in the physical therapy space?
I wish I had a better answer for you here, but thankfully, touch wood, I haven't been that injured, so I haven't got that much experience with this. I have a slap tear in my shoulder, which I was due to have keyhole surgery on to get it. It's like a little tendon that attaches. Josh will probably know better than even I can describe it because it's been like 15 years since I did it. But it's for stability of like the humerus to the shoulder joint, and basically I just have a little bit of instability within my left side. But it very soon after that, I was then laid off training for an extended time. So all the inflammation surrounding it went down, and I managed to just build up the muscles around it. So it isn't a problem for me as a bodybuilder. Probably if I was powerlifting, it'd probably become more of an issue. But before that, before I had an MRI, I had so many physio treatments and various, like, I can't even remember exactly what they were, but I had like electrodes on it, and I had like it in a sling, I had like taping, all of this stuff done to it, and obviously nothing was helping because we didn't know the core of the issue was like there's actually a tear within the shoulder. So actually just completely resting it for a good month and then slowly getting back into the gym is what ended up making it okay. But past that, that's the only serious injury I've had. I've had little niggles and little kind of creaky bits here and there, but if I manage it well in terms of like all the things I mentioned, exercise selection, volume, don't push through pain, I've actually managed to, touch wood again, not have any injury or really need to see a physio. I have had like very few physio treatments, and I find it a bit hit and miss, but I think it's like personal trainers, especially in-person personal trainers, where you can't, I don't know, it's not like it is now where you can see their body of work online and get a kind of feel for who they are. So the kind of in-person physio I saw, I had nothing, didn't know anything about him. It was just someone local. It didn't help too much, unfortunately. But then I went to Quinn Hennock. I can't even remember what the issue was. You guys might know Quinn. He works with, he did a lot of work with Juggernaut training systems, if you know Juggernaut,
Yeah.
and those guys. But anyway, I did a few sessions with him, and he really helped me get to the core of it. So it's just like physios, online PTs. So there's good ones, there's not so good ones, there's some that are for you or for others. But yeah, thankfully, I haven't really had any proper injuries. I hope it continues to go that way.
Thank God. Poo, 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 inshallah.
No broken bones, nothing like that. No kind of tendon breaks, just the slap tear, and otherwise, I'm good.
Yeah, like that's the one thing I was saying with Josh. We talked about it. Me and Josh have been on a past podcast. I think it's not only the physical therapist. Sometimes it was, you get a good or a bad physical therapist. That definitely is part of it. But I think that the actual way we treat injuries right now is the physical therapists actually are basically, if you look at it from the outside, it almost looks like they're doing a training session. Like whenever I did an in-person session with Josh, which we didn't do too many because just my schedule doesn't allow for that kind of stuff. But whenever we did do, it was, if you looked at it from the outside, it looked like a controlled training session mostly. And I think that that's changed. I think you agree with me on this, Josh, right?
Yeah, for sure. So there's, I think, a lot of overlap with what we all do as well. Like sometimes we're just helping bridge the gap of like getting them back into more of a routine. But all the strategies that Steve has been using and you use, Tony, with your clients, like it's all the same strategies we use as well. And a good chunk of injuries, you don't need, hands-on treatment. You can use that as a way of changing tissue sensitivity. And if you've got a competition or you're trying to get those marginal gains where it's really stopping you from performing, then maybe it might be appropriate. But otherwise, it's all those other things that are going to keep you active and keep you strong with it as well. I think anyone that you're kind of working with, like you mentioned, you don't know kind of the quality, but I think a bit of a telltale is if you've landed on a coach or a physio and they can't like outline a plan for you and have regular reassessment points to make sure that you're on the right track. That might be a little bit of a flag, because some of the treatment options we have, there's lots of them and we don't always know what'll work 100% for that individual, which is why you need to reassess a good chunk of people get better with with the basic science, and you just continue along that trajectory. And then you have portions of people that don't improve. So then you reassess, you try a different treatment option, and then you just consistently reassessing so that if they're not getting better, you refer them on. And I think a common thing I hear is people lose faith in the process because they've just been kind of wandering around with exercises for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and you're not really, they don't really know, and maybe the people that are looking after them don't really know what you're really trying to achieve with it. So I think that's just something to be mindful of whoever you're working with. There's a clear kind of structured plan with regular reassessment points, and you shift direction if it doesn't improve, but you've got that kind of framework in place.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens in physical therapy, it's kind of gets this idea especially in the past. I think this is obviously changing, but in the past, I would see a lot of the therapists were like scared to like progress their patients. So, if you had me 5 weeks out of a meniscus tear, partially severe meniscus tear, doing wall sits a little bit above 90 degrees, they would be scared to go anywhere lower or to get to 90. They would just be kind of keep you there. And so you would get stronger in those planes, but I never would train until I got full knee flexion again, until I can actually squat back to normal, because I never developed that musculature. One of the things that happened to me, and one of the reasons why I started thinking about this a lot, was I've lost a significant amount of muscle mass in my right leg where I've had the 2 surgeries. Both times, the second time the rehab was much better. The first time the rehab was horrendous. And I basically never trained my leg to get past like the 90-degree point ever again. So basically I couldn't shoot takedowns. I couldn't squat but ass to grass for like a decade. And my one leg is significantly smaller than the other. And I've been working on it, growing equally now. But that's something that I think is really a problem in the physical therapy space. And I think that nowadays that's changing. But to jump on to the next question, and I'm going to aim this at Steve, and then I'm curious what Josh's thoughts on this. When one of your clients gets hurt, let's say, I understand it's different because a lot of your guys compete. Like you're training, I'm sure you train some people that aren't competing, but I think most of your people that you train are competing. No, it's mostly, okay, it's mixed. I thought it was mostly competitors. But let's say someone's not competing, but they're trying to get lean and they get hurt. Do you change anything nutritionally for them? Especially, let's say it's like a muscle tear or something of that. Do you adjust their nutrition?
Good questions. Yeah, in terms of, I actually work with majority non-competitors, but they basically do a bodybuilder's off season. So they take it as seriously during their off season as what a bodybuilder would. They just don't do the nasty part or of getting down to essential levels of body fat, which is fun in some sort of way. But in regards to your question, sorry?
In a masochistic way.
Yes, exactly. I say that word, masochistic. Yeah, that's exactly it. So yeah, changing things nutritionally, it obviously always depends. When it's as severe as what you've mentioned, which means they're not going to be able to train a particular muscle for an extended period of time, I'm always like, training is the stimulus for muscle retention or growth and therefore retention. If we cannot train a muscle and we're going to continue being in a calorie deficit, for example, not only could that potentially extend recovery times because you haven't got the nutrients to help with the recovery process, and that will demand more nutrients, but you're also risking muscle loss unnecessarily, where if you're just at maintenance, the risk of muscle loss is far, far less. So I do tend to, if it's going to be meaning they can't train a muscle for an extended period of time, if someone's dieting, I want them fit and healthy, and I want them fit and healthy throughout the diet. If it's like a short-term thing where they're not able to train it for like a week or something, and we have a timeline to stick to, like again, stepping on stage, which this isn't meant to be a question to. So yeah, basically there's no timelines, and if they can't train a muscle, then yeah, not being in a calorie deficit for sure. Outside of just calories, I would say being at maintenance or a slight surplus, if they can train the rest of their body okay, is fine. But I don't really manipulate, say, hey, we got to have more protein or have less fats or change their carbs. That sort of stuff, I don't really know of why you would need to manipulate that. So mostly just continue with your high protein intake that you'd be typically doing. don't diet during a period of time where you've got an extended period where you can't train a certain muscle because you're risking unnecessary muscle loss and extending recovery timelines.
Guessing that's probably pretty hard with your population as well. If they're not training hard, the initial thought process is probably I need to reduce calorie intake because I'm not pushing as hard. And then it's a little bit of a can of worms from there.
Similar to like deloading, and they're like, oh, reduce my food. I'm like, no, the deload is recovery based. Like that's the one time you really don't want less food. And yeah, it's one of those, again, bodybuilder mentality of like harder is better and I must be pushing. So yeah, they kind of have to try and accept it. But thankfully, a lot of them are rational enough and trust me enough to be like, yeah, okay, I'll do it.
I think like reducing, again, it's getting onto stuff really, really early, like with your initial op, Tony, where you've got all the atrophy and now you can see how long it takes to try and get that back. So it's implementing strategies early to try and address it. And now we've got, blood flow restriction, like Steve said, we've got a lot of complex, like electrical stim, and lots of different ways in an early post-op recovery phase or an early injury phase where we can get some kind of stimulus that's still safe to the tissue. It's not going to increase our injury risk, but it's still going to be something. They still might be reducing, atrophying a little bit, but it's going to be nowhere near compared to not doing anything. And unless it's a high-grade muscle injury or something where you're not going to want any kind of muscle contraction. At very least, with a lot of injuries, you can be doing isometrics, submaximal isometrics. You can be doing something to get some stimulus into that muscle and then utilizing the other tools to kind of enhance that.
I'm curious when we're doing like, let's say I'm doing something like isometrics in the beginning. So I tore my quad at some point, and when I tore my quad, I didn't do, again, I was an idiot. I was like 20 years old. So I was like, I didn't think about it. I was like, whatever. I just tried to tape my quad up and keep training, and that obviously didn't work. But how much would it have helped just doing things like that I could have done probably, which would be like some isometric holds, even just straightening the leg? Is that enough stimulus to maintain muscle or at least mitigate loss? Am I mitigating a decent amount of loss by doing these small things over time?
Question. I don't have percentages for you, but certainly it's going to be useful. So as long as you're not overcooking that exercise where then you're going to delay recovery. So as long as you're getting some activation and it is comfortable and you're respecting tissue healing, then certainly it's going to be beneficial. How much it reduces atrophy with people doing isometrics at 50% versus a control group that's doing no isometrics, I'm not sure. I don't know if that study's out there or any specific numbers on it, but yeah, certainly stimulus is going to be really, really beneficial.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, this is just relates to a topic at large for me, especially with my population, is they're very black and white thinking sometimes. It's either like maximal hypertrophy or nothing. And it's like, well, if you have just less than the kind of optimal range for protein, it's not like you're getting no hypertrophy. It's just less than you could if you were meeting that. Or same here, like, yeah, dynamic contractions and doing like a full range of motion is ideal for maximal hypertrophy, but you can still get some hypertrophic benefit from an isometric contraction. It's not like it won't do anything for you. So I definitely am with Josh that like something is better than nothing. I think there's even some literature on like the cross transfer effect. So it's like if one side of your body is injured but the other side can still train, it's like, well, even training that other side might have some cross transfer to maintaining tissue to some extent the other side. So I definitely think just doing nothing is probably the worst thing you can almost do. Well, apart from continuing to push through pain and delaying kind of the recovery process, which Josh obviously mentioned too.
I like how everything that they say, that's probably the worst thing you've done. I've done all of those things. Every single one. If there's a mistake there, I've hit it at some point in time in my life. It just, makes me feel extra special today. So I actually have
people learn differently. That's okay.
Yeah, I'm just a slow learner. That's all, Leave me alone, all right? Don't bully me. All right. So look, I actually got a question. I'm curious about this, both of your opinions on this, actually. So when I'm in the hypertrophy world, there's always new, especially now because it's kind of popular. There's a bunch of science-based influencers. And I mean that in a very loving term. I'm not saying that about it. Like there's hundreds of guys that are like PhDs, guys like Milo Wolf, Dr. Pack, who they're awesome and they're constantly coming out with new studies. And then there's these giant arguments around like these really detailed changes in training, and there's like these giant arguments, which are kind of hilarious to me. But one of the things I want to know is in this, I'm sure the same thing in physical therapy. There's constantly new studies, constantly new changes to techniques. Like right now, let's say in bodybuilding, because I know more about it. Length and partials is like a big deal now. We realize that we can grow as much muscle as full range of motion, at least according to some of these studies, with just doing these length and partial movements. And a lot of people are adding it to their training. How much stuff do you guys take from the literature that's coming in, especially new literature? When do you guys start implementing it either in your training or when you're trying to rehab patients? When do you guys like, okay, I'm going to adopt this? Or do you kind of try to adopt everything slowly? What's like your criteria for filtering these things out?
Think
Do you want to attack it from a physio perspective? Yeah, there you go.
I think there's just, there's so many studies out there and there's so much information. There's different journals. It's not impossible to get bad studies published. So I think keep that in mind. There's different quality journal articles out there. And I think when you're looking at a study, ideally, you're going to read the study. You're not just going to read the abstract. So you want to actually make sure, the population that they're using in the study is appropriate for the individual in front of you. So you're not just extrapolating that information to a whole different population. So I think that's one of it. And I think the other thing is, there's a big body of evidence. So when a new study comes out and it looks exciting, I think you're interested in you're reading it and you might start to see as another treatment option in terms of utilizing it. But if it's something completely different to what's already out there, then I'd still question, the study design. Is it something that we are going to be shifting the way we're approaching something in the future? And it is a really groundbreaking study, or is it, just one piece of evidence and then we've got all this other evidence that over the years has stood the test of time, and maybe it's something that you can consider on the individuals where things aren't working and it's something you can apply, but you've still got your basic building blocks. I think that keeps coming back to the old science. I can't remember how many years now that, the hypertrophy studies and the strength studies, and there's been slight tweaks to it, but we're using a lot of the same information for kind of rehab, recovery, sleep, frequency, load management, some of these basic principles that we're seeing. If you do it consistently and done well, then that's pretty good for most people, at least in my setting. If it's a rehab and get people back to that sport, and then I hand it over to you guys, and then it's the performance side, maybe that's a little bit easier for me, where it's the small percentages. I'm like, okay, go speak to your performance coach about that now. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I think Josh said it really well, where it's those kind of big principles that we know and love in terms of like specificity, overload, fatigue management, progressive overload, those sort of things. They're not going to suddenly vanish. So there's not any research that comes out now that's groundbreaking, completely changing the game. I think the range of motion stuff has been very interesting because that was a bit different, because it was always like team full ROM, and like that was what the meta-analyses, and again, Josh rightly put out, like, what's the hierarchy of evidence here? Like one study, who's the population on? How long was it? Like, was it an in-subject design where it was like one leg doing one protocol, the other leg doing the other protocol, and that's a little bit more valid because there's like not worries about genetics and nutrition and sleep differences between participants, all of these kind of various things. It's like, right, meta-analyses are kind of where we want to be looking most of the time, and meta-analyses are just studies of studies. Like they're taking in a variety of studies and then being like, right, where does the totality of evidence lean in one direction or the other? And that's always where I remind myself when I see a study come out, is like, okay, that's a new study. Where am I currently with my beliefs on this subject? Does this nudge me in more belief with that or less strongly believing that? And then I might slightly modify something that I do. So one that I can think of that I definitely made some adjustments for was the meta-regression meta-analyses from Zach Robinson, where essentially there was like exponential hypertrophy the closer to failure that you got, and to failure. I was like, that's interesting. And people aren't very good at like gauging failure when they go higher in reps. And so that's normally isolation-based lifts, less fatigue. I'll probably go closer to failure on those more often. So that kind of nudged me in that direction. But it's similar to, so any little paper like that that's coming out, it's similar to like any personal experiences I get with clients. Like, oh, I'm doing this protocol with this client and this client and this client, and I'm getting these results. They slowly kind of also educate my practice in terms of they nudge me in a direction that I like to go with them, because this seems to be working really well. But I often also use myself as like a drawing board. So I like to say, I'll never tell my clients to do something I haven't done. I don't know if that's always true fundamentally, but for the big things it is. So I certainly was trialing, like you mentioned, length and partials for a period of time before I gave them to clients, Because also I want to know, how do I practically do this in the gym? Does it work out how I expect it to? Because yeah, you'll see coaches give people programs. You'll be like, have you ever trained in the gym? Like, that program just doesn't make any sense. Like, you could just look at it on paper and you're like, that's going to take like 2 hours, or it's going to take 10 minutes, or it's just not plausible to be able to be done. So I do like to, yeah, use that kind of nudge me in a direction with that new study. What does the bigger, broader literature say? And then trial it for myself, and then start slowly integrating it into my clients' programming. Because, yeah, certainly not suddenly changing the whole program based off one study is completely the wrong way to go. Not good science, but unfortunately people do that. And yeah, the social media kind of leads people down that route because people want quick, easy answers.
Yeah, it's funny. It's very similar to how I deal with it. When I hear a new study, like the length of partial stuff, I found personally super interesting, just because it made so much intuitive sense once it was laid out in front of me. I was like, this kind of makes sense. And you can, and I don't like this as a good proxy, but you could feel it when you're doing the length and partial exercise. It's like there is definitely things happening right now. I'm getting an insane pump. I feel like I'm a little bit sore after the exercise. I definitely know the muscles that I targeted were hit. These are good, good proxies to have. But I don't ever swing one direction or the other based on the study. I try to what were the general beliefs I have? Most of my programming's pretty straightforward for the most part, depending on your goals. And then I might add things in after I've experimented with them, after I've experimented also with clients that I know have the experience, can do it, that I've worked with for a year or 2 years. And, I wouldn't throw a brand new client and like, yeah, let's try length and partials on the leg press when I'm not even, especially doing online training, I'm not even sure you really understand how to do the leg press to begin with. Like, I would rather you learn on a full range of motion, build up that technique. And once I feel that you got it, maybe we can start adding these things in the future. That's how I take it. I'm glad to hear we're on the same page on that. One last question, and then I'm gonna let you guys go because Josh is in the Amazon somewhere hunting with bow and arrows and axes like the Viking is. I'm gonna have one last question. What's your advice for any athletes right now? And I'm gonna say athletes particularly because there are some of the people that watch this are MMA fighters. Some of them are bodybuilders, powerlifters. I've actually quite an array of people that watch. What's your advice to them if they are feeling some kind of injury? What their approach should be? Like, we've outlined some stuff, but maybe like some 3 things that they should focus on going forward into their next, working with their physical therapist and coach.
Do you want to go for it, Josh?
I'll just use up 3 of your old ones, and then you'll have to come up with new ones. So it'll be perfect. So I think, yeah, just monitoring how it's progressing over time, because like I mentioned, a lot of niggles or awareness or tissue sensitivity gets better without, any assessment or input. So if you feel something, just be aware of it, track your progress over time. And then the simple strategies, like Steve mentioned, in terms of reducing range of motion rather than just thinking, I'm going to get rid of the exercise, or where people completely deload and then, it takes a little bit longer to get them back up. So try some simple strategies, decrease the range of motion, decrease the weight a little bit. If that's not working, change the exercise to have a similar effect with it. And then the third thing, if you're still struggling, speak to a coach, speak to a physio. If you feel like you can't manage it yourself, it doesn't have to be, if we get to it early, it's not necessarily a big rehab plan or anything. It might just be advice and education around how to train around it, and then just get you back onto the right path and give you some information for the future. And then you continue to self-manage it.
Yeah, really well said. Yeah, I would say if I could try and think of 3 different ones that we've not maybe talked about that much. So one would be, don't aggressively change things. Sometimes I see guys get very eager to add load, especially load. So if they add large percentages of load to week, that's a recipe for disaster. You want to go slowly with these sort of things. If you come out of a deload or a recovery period, don't suddenly go all out to failure with tons of volume, tons of weight. Kind of slowly ramp things up. Allow your body to adapt to things gradually over time. And that can go for reintegrating some exercises or things that could have caused you an injury or ranges of motion, slowly reintegrate. That'd be one. The other would be don't freak out. So if you are kind of, I don't know, something crops up, like don't freak out and completely like throw the baby out with the bathwater type of thing. Kind of look at all the things that Josh just mentioned in terms of where you can manage that and try and have a bit of a stoic kind of philosophy surrounding it. That's why I try and get people to embrace, like, yeah, recognize it's a problem, but focus on what you can control, not on what you can't. And particularly as a bodybuilder, or if you're not specifically like a power lifter where you have to do like the big three, there's just so many tools at your disposal to be able to still generate the stimulus and get the response that we want. And also just recognize, don't think of satisfying just like your ego and your needs and wants today. Think about what would the person like the next day, the next week, the next month wish you'd done now. And I guess that comes back to my, I guess, final point is like, if things crop up early, like recognize them early. Don't just think they're going to vanish. If they are starting to build up, change something before they become a problem and you have to go see a physio. Ideally you can kind of avoid that, obviously happens, but yeah, that's something that's allowed me to really get away with not needing to go see physios or do anything dramatic, is because when something starts building up, I'm just like, let's make a change, because there's no point being stubborn and just forcing and going through pain.
I really like that. Guys, this has been awesome. And by the way, if you guys do want to help your future selves and you are feeling any injuries, you guys could go hit up Revive Stronger, watch his podcast. His coaching is awesome. But if you guys want a different approach, you can also come to Lifetime Transformations. Josh also works for us down there, so he will help you guys if you do have any injuries coming up and you guys need it. Feel free to reach out. I'm going to link the Revive Stronger podcast YouTube link so you guys can go watch the podcast, and I'm going to put Steve's Instagram in there so you guys can go contact him if you're looking for coaching. I'm going to put Josh's Instagram down there too if you guys want to reach out for physio. I'll put mine on there if you want to reach out for coaching and physio, and we'll hook you guys up. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Super appreciate it. Josh, go back to happy huntings. Steve, let's get back to this cold.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks so much. Be safe.
Take care.